Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have an incredible episode, of course, because we're having a guest back. We haven't had a guest in a while on a regular episode, and we had a guest episode last week on our IQ supplement, which you should listen to if you haven't already. But this week, we're now even having the regular episode with a guest who is an expert on various topics that we're going to discuss today. And that guest is Irkutyanin, who is a Russia, Eastern European expert, and also a Memphis expert. So we've brought him on to discuss the latest news from those two areas. So Irk, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Scott. Good to be back on the show.
It's great to have you. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the most pressing news, and that is the police beating death of Tyre Nichols. Tyre Nichols, it's been going on more of a story. They've recently charged the 5 officers with murder. All 5 of them are black. And they released the body cam footage and other footage of the assault last Friday, which it showed some rather unprofessional behavior, to say the least, from the officers in this incident. So I want to get your thoughts first on Irk. What do you make of this story, and what do you think of its impact on Memphis? Or why do you think that there's a special Memphis quality to this story that the media may be overlooking?
Yes, Scott, there's quite a few different things that are going on in this one, both locally and I'm sure we'll get to the implications nationally, because I do think because of the demographics of this incident, it won't have quite the appeal that as sort of a media maelstrom that say the things in 2020 were doing. But in Memphis itself, ever since 2020, we've seen a fairly big spike in crime. And when we've seen like this image of being sort of being concerned about police demographics, we've seen these initiatives being taken by the city have to sort of rein in the increasing crime that's been happening in the city itself, while also keeping a sort of demographic parity, or like basically non-politically hostile demographics within this force. So basically not increasing amounts of mostly black Memphians who are being police officers. So that was a very important factor going into this particular beating, because the unit that pulled over Tyree was the Scorpion unit, and it was a unit that was specifically meant to rein in these increasingly chaotic and crime-ridden areas that are sort of the most...
You could even call them magical areas. Maybe we'll call them magical. There's a lot of magic going on. Call those areas Hogwarts. There's so much magic going on.
Yes. Memphis is quite the magical music city. But we have sort of this unit was pretty much explicitly created to handle these types of problems, and handle them in a way that wouldn't get the immediate media attention of having like a white cop on like black shooting, right? And so this is kind of spectacularly backfired on them in this particular instance, because they probably were directly demographically recruiting, and they lowered standards probably to get the unit in practice.
Yeah, and they did lower these standards. At least 2 of the officers were brought in under reduced standards the least Memphis had implemented in there. One of them was the aforementioned Tadarius Bean, and the other one was Demetrius Haley. I don't think those Tadarius, I don't know if that's an Anglo-Saxon rooted name, but those are 2 of the officers who were let in under these reduced standards. And you can definitely tell the reduced standards of how they arrested this guy. Like, even if you've seen like usually majority white officers or just like non-black officers dealing with some of these situations, whether it's George Floyd or anything, there is a type of professionalism with them. They're like, all right, even the George Floyd, they're trying to negotiate with him. The one unprofessional aspect you can maybe see is that Chauvin kept his knee on Floyd's neck the whole time, but the whole time the police at least trying to have a pretense of professionality. In this clip, they're like the whole time you think this is a world star clip, and it's like gangbangers who just like track down a rival, and they're pissed that they made this rival made them run, because the whole time every sentence ends with bruh or begins with bruh. They even I think they've dropped even the N-word a few times in talking to the guy. At one point, the guy with the body cam says, "I'm going to baton the fuck out of you," which I don't think that's going to help him in court. Also, these guys, the way, and then they're complimenting each other for how that guy just knocked him out. And the whole thing is like, these guys are officers. Somebody made the point that you would think that this was like 5 gangbangers just like randomly assaulting like a civilian, that like that's like Tyre Nichols. Like Tyre Nichols sounds more articulate than the officers who were arresting him, even though it appears that Tyre Nichols was on high on something, and that's why he gave chase to these officers, and these officers were pissed that he made their lives difficult, and thus they decided to give him a beating in response to that.
Yeah. Another thing that I'd kind of like to call attention to as well is that we had the chase that went on in before he was finally brought out of the car. And if you go on like the 240 like 55 loop that's around Memphis, you can pretty much see daily people who are weaving in and out of traffic at like 120 130 miles an hour in like their Nissan Altima, as they like go out onto the exits and continue at like 80 90 miles into these off the exit and into like the main streets, like Parkway or something like that. But these are it's contributed to another thing that goes along with the rise in crime. It's like Memphis has something like almost 40,000 accidents like last year, and like only about 300 to 400 of them are fatal. We have a couple thousand, several thousand in major injuries, but still, if you're ever on that loop, you can pretty much be guaranteed that you're going to meet at least one accident as you're driving through, no matter what time of day you're going through or like where you're going. You're probably going to meet some form of accident on there. So the sort of safety situation generally along the highways and within these areas switching from the interstate to the main thoroughfares of the city has been dangerous for some time.
Yeah, and I think you even shared some figures with me, and it included my home county or the county I grew up in Tennessee, and Memphis had like 20 or 30 times the amount of accidents than my county. And I was not in a rural county. I was in a county that only has a slightly bit of less. I mean, it's a Nashville suburb so it has a little bit less of a population, but the accidents are just way higher than Memphis. I mean, the benefits of diversity, I guess you could say, the differences that's in there. But Memphis has been low key one of the worst cities in America for a while. I don't think people talk about it so much. Maybe it's because Baltimore is closer to, it's in the Acela corridor, it's right by DC. People, you can go up an hour from DC and experience the wonders of Baltimore. And then Baltimore had the riots in 2015. So it's more of a story, but Baltimore and Memphis, I think Memphis, they sometimes compete for who has the higher murder rate. And Memphis has, for the past 3 years, has had a murder rate about 50 per 100,000. That in perspective, average European murder rates for nationwide are usually barely 1 per 100,000. The American murder rate is, I think, 6 or 7 per 100,000. And for Memphis, it's 50 per 100,000. They've had around 300 murders from every year from 2020, 2021, and 2022. And it's usually competing. I mean, Baltimore is also in that horizon as well. It's usually in the top 5 murder cities, but people don't really focus on it enough. But there was that story of the white teacher who was an heiress who got kidnapped and murdered by some random magic criminal in there. And I remember when this story broke, that people thought, well, this woman has all this money. It must have been, the fiance. I think it was a fiance or husband who must have been involved, and then it had to be something to do with her money. And it turned out to be no, it's just the consequences of living in Memphis that this horrible event happened. That this is like a common thing in Memphis, and that brought more attention to how horrible Memphis is as a city. It's also been a city where they've really tried to wage war on the suburbs because 20 years ago, there was a lot of these suburban schools that were fairly close to Memphis. I think, Germantown and Collierville are in the county, are in Shelby County. Am I right?
Yeah, you're right.
So I'm just double checking to make sure. And these are still, I haven't been to them in a long time, but I remember Germantown. It was still pretty nice 10 years ago. I assume Collierville is still pretty nice. And those schools were majority white 20 years ago, and still largely majority white even 15 years ago. But with Germantown, this once considered one of the best public high schools in Tennessee, usually was attacked as a ritzy place. I remember when my high school played them in some football game 20 years ago. I wasn't in high school at the time, but I was going to go into that high school. And the local newspaper attacked both schools for being a place full of rich white kids. And I think it's like, not even a third white anymore. And they've really been trying to push the undertow of Memphis further out into the suburbs. And if for people who are Tennessee natives, Memphis city schools are talked about like the worst jungles of Vietnam, like for Vietnam veterans, of like people there. Like they are considered some of the most hellish schools in the United States of America. I even knew kids in college who had went to some of these schools, and they had like insane stories from them. But they've really been trying to push out those people to further into the suburbs, and even the suburbs are now even retreating outside the county to save their kids from the bad school demographic. As I tweeted out this weekend, whites don't see race; they just see good schools and bad schools, and now they're having a really bad school problem even in the Memphis suburbs. So, I'll discuss a little bit of how those changes went about. That these once nice suburbs where you could expect to have good schools there, they've now turned into a bad school area.
Yeah, I mean, it follows the general trajectory that we've seen in like America since the 1960s and the civil rights era, where you have a considerable amount of white flight out to the suburbs as like cities, like the city centers become places that no longer can really support families. Like if you go to Memphis today, basically like on the outskirts of what is today Midtown, there's like there's a big high school, I believe, on Poplar, or maybe it's a little bit further south. But anyway, like it's not very far into the modern day city of Memphis, and it was the easternmost boundaries of the city in like the 1960s, right? But you've seen this move out first to suburbs like Germantown. Collierville came a little bit later in terms of expansion, but essentially you had a ring around Memphis, the early ring around Memphis, which is now the 240 interstate, like I-40 and 240 circle. And now if you look at like a map, like even a Google Maps, you can see they're building this even larger ring, the 269 ring, which goes beyond Collierville, and it goes into like Tennessee 385, which, I mean, it's like the city's massive at this point. It goes into Bartlett. It goes out of Shelby County, both to like the the east to Piperton and north to Atoka. And then like it also is going into Arkansas now. Like they're crossing over and they're choosing to live in Marion or even like the outskirts of West Memphis. Even though West Memphis is not a good city at all, but they're choosing to live in those areas over living in Memphis. So
Is
we're seeing
West Memphis still like very redneck, or as depicted from all the documentaries about the West Memphis Three?
you know, it's very funny because they make it out to be like that, but no, it's basically similar demographics to Memphis, but like slightly more rural. But that was like
Okay.
even back then during the documentaries. Now they've with like the conjuncture of 45 and or sorry 55 and 40 there. Like it's like there's like a ton of truck stops and hotels and things like that that are out there now because people would rather stay if they're like a trucker like passing through or something. They'd rather stay out in West Memphis than go into the city.
In proper Memphis.
Right.
I understand with that. I mean, even driving through Memphis is bizarre because it's, you can even drive through rush hour and you'll be surprised by how little traffic there is for a major city. Compared to like even just like a place like Nashville or Atlanta, you'd be like, isn't there supposed to be more cars on the road? Where are the people? And even some of the downtown nightlife. I remember one time going on Beale Street and cops had, or cop cars blocking all the like major intersections into Beale Street where like there could be no traffic through. And it's very bizarre to see a city like that when even like compared to other popular downtown spots for throughout the South, they don't go as far as Memphis does. I don't know if they still do that, but they were doing that, 10 or so years ago.
Yeah, I mean, if you if anyone who's listening to this ever drives through the city, you could go and start at like Collierville or Bartlett, and you could drive all the way to the center of downtown, and you'll go from basically the affluent areas, like of people who work in FedEx and like all the other companies that are there, that are the sort of McMansion style that people talk about, and like now probably include a significant amount of people from sort of high human capital income, like immigrant groups, like from South Asia or East Asia. But then, you get to about the midway point through the city, especially if you're going either from like the north or the south, and it just becomes like total third world. I mean, it's like the entire you can tell that no one spent like very much money like keeping up anything, and there's just like decrepit buildings everywhere. I mean, they've basically written off like large sections of that city because there's no there's no return there.
They still have the Bass Pro Pyramid though, so that's at least they still have that, which a lot of people like. I understand the memes. It's like really funny to talk about, but some people even go as far to be like, this is so base that they had the Bass Pro Pyramid, but it's like, well, it's surrounded by ruins. Not they may have that, but that's about it for Memphis in terms of what they great things that they may have. But they have the Bass Pro Pyramid. I even saw a tweet is like more European cities should look like this. And it's like, I don't wish that on anyone, especially on Europe. To have to be cursed with the Bass Pro Pyramid City in America, but yeah, they do have the stuff like that. It's also if for people who are not out of the South but who grew up in the South, there is this like thing if you go to any of these cities that there's just like a large degree of wandering magic Americans, just like kind of like in the middle of the day, they're all just like wandering around. You're like, I wonder what they're doing with their just wandering around, which a lot of Northerners, whenever they confront that, they're like, what the hell? What is this happening in any Southern city? If you go to Charlotte, Atlanta, Chattanooga, Knoxville, even parts of Nashville and certainly Memphis, you'll see this. But one thing I noticed is that they're in larger groups in Memphis than elsewhere. And in other places, it'll just be one or two. But then you'll see like a whole crowd of them just like marching through the city. Like hopefully this red light turns green soon, and more way, and when you're driving through Memphis. But going outside of Memphis, and what people are wanting to make this story about is it's not specifically a Memphis story is that they're trying to make. It's like, they're blaming this on white supremacy, but Memphis has been a black controlled city for probably 50 years, for at least 40 years. I would have to see. You would probably know when they first elected a black mayor. I would guess probably sometime in the 80s.
Yeah.
And I think they have a white mayor now again, like they have a white congressman with Steve Cohen. Somehow it works out. I think it's that a lot of their leaders are so corrupt that they all get sent to jail, and like the one guy who's not a corrupt ends up being the like lone white guy in the city council, and they elect that guy. And I think that's what happened with even Steve Cohen, because the Ford family, which Harold Ford Jr., who's like a popular Fox News commentator, always comes off as like a moderate Democrat. His family were like the real power players in Memphis in the 90s. But a lot of them went to jail. And Harold Ford Jr. was one of the few who did not go to jail. But that's like a lot of the city, is that it's been black controlled for a while. Their police department, according to 2014 figures, and it's likely higher now, was majority black. It was like 52% black then. I would probably bet it's at least 60% black now. Even when those officers arrested that guy, all the backup officers, if you saw them coming out of the car, were also black. And so there was no white supremacy at play at all in the city council. All the institutions, attorneys, judges, all of them are black. And even if they're not black, they have to accommodate black power in the city, because there's like no white institutional power there at all anymore. So this is more, and the fact that they lowered standards to make the police department more diverse or get more cops there because they probably have trouble recruiting officers. This is not so much of an example of police brutality and police racism towards blacks as that they just show casually, as that some of these commentators try to claim is that these officers, by being police officers, assimilate to some type of white supremacy or white supremacist thinking towards blacks when they put on the badge. And this is what needs to be corrected. Is the real problem here is that this is what life is like in a city where only a certain demographic controls it, and this is the way police work, this is the way the courts work, this is the way the city government works, and you end up with this police brutality, this completely unprofessional instance, which puts the George Floyd case to shame in terms of like how those police conducted their behavior. This is really just going to be more calls to makes all cities less safe, more like Memphis, because they're trying to aim for a qualified immunity to go after officers. So if they take away qualified immunity, that means that opens them up to frivolous lawsuits. Going to even more like dictates on what use of force they can use, which once again, these officers were just such idiots. I think they failed to deploy a taser. They also maced themselves. It's like the problem wasn't use of force. The problem was incompetent officers. But they're really just going to be like, well, you can't use baton, you can't use mace anymore. You just have to negotiate with these guys. And the real effect will just be to reduce policing and to make more cities like Memphis. So any thoughts on that, Irk?
Yeah, I would like to say there with the in regards to the now white mayor of Memphis, you saw a similar. Most of the Mississippi Valley follows the same sort of the urban locations inside the Mississippi Valley follow the same sort of political logic. Like after Ray Nagin in like New Orleans was totally disgraced, you have Landrieu as mayor, right? So similar things. And what's been kind of interesting for me to see is to see like there's these stories that sort of fit generally the sort of ones that they want to tell nationally, right? So with this one, you have police brutality that's made into a larger issue within America as a whole to use against cities that don't have the demographics of Memphis. And we saw this, 2 years ago with Jackson, Mississippi, which is, I would argue, an even more dysfunctional city than
Yeah,
Memphis.
it's the worst city in America.
It's like they have like 100 per 100,000 homicide rate, and their entire water infrastructure system has completely just failed. Even though they're in, one of the sort of densest areas on the planet for, water supply or collection if they wanted to do it. You've had like essentially um, a unilateral, like, I mean, the demographics of Jackson are even worse than Memphis.
Yeah, it's
So
almost 90% black at this point. Almost
yeah,
completely.
and I mean it's been controlled by literal black nationalists for since like the 70s. So it's like there's a lot of different factors there, but like what gets blown up into the national story is the failure of the water system because it looks like Flint, Michigan, right? It's like one of these other things that you can sort of just generally point at without having to provide any sort of like negative context around these issues and say that it's still going to have the meaning in Atlanta or DC or Chicago that it's going to have in Memphis. And sure, it could very well be that way in 20, 30 years or so, but that's not they're not framing it in that way.
Yeah, with Jackson, in the same way with Memphis, they blame all the problems on white supremacy, and it's like you've had black governors. They've had a black mayor since the early 90s. That's actually fun. Jackson, Mississippi was still plurality white 30 years ago, roughly 30 years ago, and it's I think only 12% white now. It's in the teens for how many white people they have. I feel like all the white people who live in the city have something to do with the state government, which is one of the most conservative state governments in America, if not the most conservative state government in America. That's it. But it's literally hell on earth. But anytime they talk about the city, they always blame the white supremacist state government. And the state government gives them things. It's like, look, you have incompetent people running the water management. We've tried to have this program to help you guys, get your water management under control, and you guys just won't do this. And you have nepotism in who you choose to run the water management system, and they're not capable of doing this. And the state wants to take over the water management, which would be a smarter option, but the city doesn't want to do that. They just want more money to throw down the toilet, throw down in their water filtration system, perhaps, and then just the problem will continue, and then they can blame white supremacy and demand reparations. I mean, anytime there's like a storm in Mississippi, Jackson loses power. Period. Like, no matter the storm, they lose power instantly, and thus we always have these problems of just like they're without power again in Jackson, Mississippi. And so you're going to see this in a lot more cities like that. I mean, as a lot of these white people retreat from the cities, and it's just put in where the political power base is, and they're more concerned with getting handouts from the state and calling the state racist, rather than providing competent government management and government services. And so it's like sad because a lot of these cities were nice places at one point. You can go and watch clips of Jackson, even from like the 70s, and it's like a very nice city. And today it's a complete shithole, and a lot of cities are going to end up like that. I mean, even a place like Baltimore. I mean, Baltimore, nicknamed Charm City. It's now a shithole, and you see that throughout the South. I mean, even with the Magic City, my favorite, the Magic City in Birmingham, it's not as bad as Jackson or Baltimore or Memphis, but even a lot of these other cities are pretty bad due to the demographic issue and who gains political power and how they use political power in any time. And always the solution to these problems, whether it's policing or water management, it's like, you need to put this in the hands of the community. Like, we need community policing. Well, we see the effects of community policing in the Tyre Nichols case, and everyone is upset about it. And thus, the community policing is obviously not the solution to this problem. It's to get the type of police officers who will follow the law in a professional manner and actually deal with criminals in the proper manner, rather than it turning into a world star hip hop video. And so I think that's a good conclusion to make on the Memphis story. If you have any further thoughts, Irk, before we move on to another war-torn shithole in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, there is one thing that I'd like to point out for this is that we've seen a lot of protests in the immediate aftermath of this, but effectively they're pretty low energy, especially when you look at 2020. But I do think that there is a certain implication to be made from the outcome of these protests, because the unit Scorpion that was that pulled over Tyree there is disbanded now. Yeah. And we saw, it wasn't very large, but we saw a minor dip in criminality in the statistics for 2022 across the but in some of the worse urban areas and in the other parts of the country too. And I think that a lot of this was city councils finding some sort of compromise with basically gangland, community police measures like this. And so now that those are getting scrapped and they're trying to do away with them after this extremely negative press event, you could see a further climb in criminality when we finally get to 2024, if there's anything like a repeat of 2020 that year.
Yeah, I think, and there's been a few cities where I think the murder rate was either equal or higher. I think New Orleans, they had a higher murder rate this year, and Philadelphia's, I think, was roughly equivalent to the record they set last year, or set in 2021. So some cities are like that, but yeah, I think if there's any real result from this, and then there's more demands for police reform, all it's going to lead to is the slight drop in crime in 2022, which compared to the 2010s, it's still higher, but compared to 2021 and 2020, it was a little bit lower. I think that drop could be totally erased, and you're right, by 2024 we could be maybe even a higher murder rate than there was in 2021. So on that note, we are going to switch to another country with infrastructure problems and a high death rate, and that is, of course, Ukraine. The Ukraine war continues to chug along, and now the West is sending them more tanks, and it also talks about sending them advanced aircraft to combat the Russian special military operation. We'll still call it the special military operation, even though hasn't Putin declared a formal declaration of war yet?
No, not okay. Formal. No, he's actually referred to the special military operation as a war, sort of extemporaneously, right? So it's even the leadership of Russia is calling it a war, when they're speaking about it, off the record or off the cuff, right? But no, the still designation is that it's a special military operation, even though it's clearly assumed larger parameters.
Yeah. So it's the war is going on, and people continue to debate what is the war's meaning and how is it going. So I think, Irk, giving just to start off, to give us an update on where the war is right now. There's been a few Russian gains this winter in the Donetsk area. So why don't you give us the basic outline of how the war looks right now and where Russia's standing is and Ukraine's standing? This may take a little bit, but you have all the time in the world. So take it away, Irk.
Right. So after the withdrawal and retreat from the Kharkiv area and the Kherson area, you've seen Russian forces concentrate more along the axis running from sort of North Lugansk, the Kremenaya, Sviatovo area, to the Dnieper River, although they no longer control the crossing over the Dnieper River, which is a big it could have big geopolitical significance if there's a conclusion to the war that doesn't see a Russian return to that side of the bank. So there's some major strategic implications there, political implications that could be made from the Russian pullback from Kherson that will last for considerable amount of time if they don't go back. But in recent months, they've made some slow progress along in the Donbas area, and they've attacked a little bit in the Zaporozhye Oblast area as well. They've advanced a couple dozen kilometers in that area recently. And right now, the main fighting is taking place, a nexus going from Soledar to Bakhmut, right? And you see Bakhmut is a fairly large urban area in the Donbas region. It had a lot of industry before before 2014, and it's a critical junction in the road and rail system for the rest of the area. If, as we see now, the Russians are trying to surround the city, going south to west, and also surrounding the northern, or trying to surround it from the north, and essentially envelop the city in a similar fashion, basically trying to create another Mariupol situation, because Ukraine still has to send units in to defend Bakhmut. It's part of a major fortification system within Donbas. However, there are limits to the significance of Russian victory at Bakhmut. Certainly, after sacrificing so many men for it, the Ukrainians don't want the fall of Bakhmut to take up a large amount of the international press. And there is a defensive line around Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantivka. But they are all the sort of out. It's the area that's going out of Donbas, and after that, they'll be, if the Russians approach there, they're going to also be back in Kharkov Oblast from the south, and it puts the Ukrainian situation as being forced out of Donbas as something that happens in the war. So that's the sort of political or psychological significance of this fighting that's going on right now in Bakhmut, is that if Bakhmut falls, the Ukrainians sent a significant amount of soldiers to this point, and they've lost a significant amount holding it. And if they have to pull back, they'll be pulling back to the last cities within the Donetsk Oblast, right? So, and it'll be the ones that were significant for the original Russian separatist uprising there. But there's a lot of other questions that stem from things going on in Ukraine or Belarus or the western part of Russia, and it's that, will there be a second front reopened sometime in the spring? Will the Russians return to Sumy and Kharkov Oblast from the northeast, advancing into those? And I still don't really know that. I still don't know if the Russian state is going to commit to that. But it sure does seem, as opposed to the last time we talked about Donbas, or even fall of last year, where I thought maybe the political goal is to reach a ceasefire and declare victory after having received Donbas from Ukraine, basically. Now I don't think that there's quite as much room to negotiate a way out if the Russians only take, a couple more cities in the Donbas region. We've committed, at least on paper, these new armaments, and we're talking about sending planes. And what's really more crucial than the planes or the tanks are the missile systems and drones and any sort of artillery system or multi-rocket launcher system. There's going to be some pretty significant political incentives, I think, for the Ukrainians to not reach an agreement, even if the war does go worse in the Donbas region than it has been going. And recently there's been some talk that I've seen of people saying that this is the new forever war, right? And I think a little bit of that is millennials like having pictures of the last war, right? Like Afghanistan. I mean, it just kind of happens that every commentator upon these things sees the last war. And while that's certainly the case, I think, in this situation, I think there is a legitimate concern that it is the type of war that America likes to fight. The sort of war that brought enormous geopolitical benefit to America in World War I and World War II, where you can have Europeans basically do the fighting for you and sort of shore up contracts with militaries and become as involved as possible without really being involved, so that you don't really waste actual political capital fighting the war. So there is a definite scenario that takes place that this is a very drawn out conflict that will take place over an immense amount of areas, and no one's really looking for any way out in terms of negotiations.
And we'll go back to that second part, but there's something I want to address that I see a common meme stated on the online sphere and even some Telegram accounts. And it's strongly believed by one of our friends, who I will not name. This friend has, he's very confident that there's going to be a massive Russian winter offensive sometime soon, even though this same friend, once again not naming him, was confident Blake Masters would win, even though Blake Masters on Halloween wore a C-3PO costume, and he refused to acknowledge Blake Masters wearing the C-3PO costume, even though that cost Blake Masters the election. And the same friend, once again not naming him, was confident that Avatar 2 would be an incredible movie and showed up at the premiere all excited. I believe he was prepared to soy jack. And then he, unlike with the Blake Masters C-3PO costume, he admitted that it was a bad movie, despite all of his relentless propagandizing about how great the movie is. So do you think that the Russian winter offensive is just another one of these confident assertions that is no longer going to happen, or is it a possibility that could be delayed to the spring? Because it seems that most of Russia's efforts now, there's a lot of fighting, of course, along Bakhmut and Soledar, but it doesn't appear to meet the expectations of what people thought the Russian massive Russian offensive would be this winter.
Yeah, I think that friend is having his black pill winter offensive. There's going to be temperatures around these next few weeks, like early February, where it's still cold on the ground's still frozen, there's snow everywhere, and the ground is going to be hard, where you could potentially see something happen in other sectors, right? If there is going to be something in Sumy or Kharkov, I would assume that it's going to be in early February, but I frankly just don't really see it happening. And the advances that are going to be within Donbas or even in Zaporozhye, they're going to be very slow. I mean, this type of warfare has been very positional, bombardment and fortification heavy. And so every advance that happens, I mean, we're talking about, fighting that's happening every day that's going on for 200 to 300 meters of important fortification and entrenchment lines. And, that's not going to be something where we see like big dramatic breakouts and sudden, like, quote unquote, big arrow offensives. But I think that one of the reasons we've seen focus on armor recently, even though armor hasn't really played that huge of a role in this war, is that I think that it is currently sort of in the same position as World War I cavalry, which I mean, the cavalry units were built for maneuvering and basically sending like a large amount of troops as fast as possible around the lines. And when you have lines that sort of are static and are based around entrenchments and artillery duels, you can't really use cavalry and can't really use armor to break through or sort of, envelop opponents in that sort of sense either. After they leave Donbas, they'll be fighting on what is essentially open steppe land, and that land is more conducive to armor maneuvers and sort of open, like large open areas that you can drive these things through. But I think we're still quite a ways off if we're ever going to actually see that, because that type of use of tank armies that we saw the Germans and the Soviets use in 41 to 44 across Ukraine doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, it does to a certain extent. We have a bunch of tanks, but I think, predominantly if these Abrams and Leopards go to Ukraine, I think their primary function, if they were ever used in anger, would be, if the Russians ever do break through these fortification lines, would be to meet the armor in a certain area where they might be breaking out. But it's a limited application, so I just don't see the big arrow thing happening in the immediate future. As sad as that is, I'm sure, for the friend here.
For the friend, but we're clear-pilled about this conflict, so we're neutral on this conflict, so it's more just observing as outsiders. But with a lot of people talk about the Russian strategy is more not to gain territory, but to just waste a lot of Ukrainian lives and Ukrainian resources, which they've been doing with these attacks on the infrastructure, even their artillery warfare, where they seem to be lining up all these Ukrainian soldiers as cannon fodder for their missiles and artillery attacks. Do you think that this is actually their strategy, is just to just cause as many casualties as possible and hope that the Ukrainian military loses out on its reservoir of manpower? Or do you think that this is just the Russians just opting for a safer way to wage the war? Because when you're waging, it seems that they seem to accrue less casualties with this type of warfare than what they were doing at the beginning of the war. And it seems to, I guess, have some type of gains, but they also seem to have accrued a lot of casualties in taking Soledar. So what do you think of this? Is that their proper strategy, is just not to so much gain ground, but to just continue to waste Ukrainian manpower in preparation for another attack, or what, or just in the hopes that Ukraine will lose so many lives that they'll agree to some type of ceasefire?
Yeah, I don't really quite buy that we're actually, or that the Russians are actually just going to bleed the Ukrainians by the strategy they're currently using. I mean, even though the Ukrainians are taking more casualties than the Russians at the moment, and there are major problems with sort of new mobilizations and recruitments, and they're trying to get people who fled Ukraine to go to the Baltic states or Poland. They've been trying to get the Polish to send them the men back into Ukraine in order to put them in the army. And there certainly is a loss of manpower aspect to it, but politically, I think the Ukrainians can survive it. And I think that's the key issue, because I don't think the Russian leadership is prepared to take losses on the same sort of level that the Ukrainians are. And even in Soledar, the people who took Soledar were the PMC Wagner guys, right? And it's the PMC Wagner guys who are stationed around Bakhmut and are doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of clearing trenches and advancing. And these guys, as we know, they're contractors, they're mercenaries. Some of their recruitment goes on in prisons where they're able to basically get prisoners to fight in their formation and in exchange for their freedom. And I think that reveals a sort of fundamental weakness about the Russian military operation, is that they really aren't geared to accept these level of casualties that they'll need to eventually do if they want to ever take ground. And that is partially why the mobilization, as it's been so far, took so long to do, and why we still see a sort of hesitancy to commit large amounts of regulars or even reservists to the fighting that's going on in Ukraine. So I would say that it's a sort of casualty aversion by the Russians that sort of forces the strategy of pause and wait warfare over any sort of 3D 8D chess that they're playing in order to sort of bleed out the Ukrainians, like the Germans failed to do to the French at Verdun, right? Like, I mean, it's like there's not truly a overall vision, I think, that the Russian state has for how it wants the war to conclude. And that's been a problem since the beginning of the special military operation. And as it goes on, though, I think that the situation it's become more dire. And originally, the Russians weren't even targeting bridges or infrastructure. They weren't targeting electrical infrastructure in the rear areas of Ukraine. And that's something they started to do when they realized that they would have to basically do it in order to disrupt operations on the front. So it's something that's basically at every stage of the level. It has been the Ukrainians and the Westerners that have been forcing Russia's hand to escalate to a more serious stage that otherwise I don't think the Russian leadership would be comfortable in doing, because they frankly just don't have a very solid vision for what they want out of the Ukrainian war. It's basically just kind of a stopgap to prevent themselves from losing everything, I think.
Yeah, I'm starting to agree with that, but I still see so many people who are like, Russia is definitely winning this. And what is the new code posting is that I'm seeing is that Russia is building a mighty multi-polarity alliance against the West, and that there's so many people backing them. And I joked about this because somebody did a comparison of the GDP compared to of Ukraine supporters or allies compared to the GDP of people who are neutral. And this includes like China, which is taking a neutral position. It's now, Russia is heavily dependent on China now, but they're formally neutral. They're not really giving them any military weapons or any of that type of support in the way that the West is giving Ukraine. They're there. And so even if you took away that GDP, it'd be minuscule. And so all these people claiming that there's this huge, the globalist American empire is taking a huge hit because mighty Cameroon and all these African third world countries are not sanctioning Russia, which it's like, what do they have to sanction Russia about? And they're like, this is huge. We're about to win. And you guys just don't know this yet, that Russia is building a very powerful alliance, including Cameroon and Pakistan and some other third world countries. And this is somehow going to topple the gay, which at the same time, the globalist American empire is ensuring Europe is more compliant to its demands. Like Europe tells all these countries to empty out their inventory and then buy more arsenal supplies from America. America tells Europe to cut off its energy dependence on Russia and buy American. They're doing so, and Europe matters far more than mighty Cameroon in this battle. But people still say that this war is leading to multipolarity and that the gay is going to take a huge hit in this war, when I argue that Russia and Ukraine aren't really the winners here, or it doesn't look like they will be the true victors. But the true victor, no matter what the war happens, unless somehow Russia, makes a massive breakthrough and they're at the border of Kiev, the gay is the real winner here because it's made Europe more dependent on us, both militarily, economically, politically, and now Russia is more isolated from Europe, and it's basically a junior partner, a very dependent partner on China and all these third world shitholes. I mean, they've survived the sanctions regime, but at the same time, they're not going to build a powerhouse with these failed African states. So what are your thoughts on that, and why people are stressing that angle so much?
Right. So I will say that you can see this sort of dynamic play out in the negotiations to send the Leopards to Ukraine, and that the Biden administration agreed to send M1 Abrams to Ukraine, but it's going to take like a full year to get those Abrams out there, whereas the Germans just kind of surrender their stocks to the Ukrainians as soon as they're able, right? And other countries too, they've sort of lifted the ban on sending everyone else who's bought the variants of the Leopard to Ukraine. And that's the sort of basic dynamic. You want America wants the European states to sort of fit the bill for this conflict and to send their own stocks there, and then to eventually replenish those stocks with presumably eventually American weapons. So you see that dynamic play out there pretty quickly, and there's no innate German party that's going to say this isn't in the interests of Germany, or it isn't in the interests of Norway or Sweden or Denmark to send Leopards to Ukraine. No one's going to say that politically because they don't have any sort of vision for what Europe should be geopolitically either. So in that sense, like, it is a very big victory for the American establishment. And I would say that if the war ends and America is able to keep, the ports of southwestern Ukraine, Odessa, Nikolaev, even Kherson, like now, if they're able to do that, they've also secured these massive projects that they had been building up since like the 2010s, like the Ochkiv Naval Base and other facilities that allow them to use the remainder of Ukraine as a giant sort of agricultural project that gives them leverage of grain shipments over the Middle East as well. So it's like, anything barring like almost a total Russian victory in this war, which the Russians themselves don't really seem that committed to, is going to be like a absolute loss for Russia. It's also going to be a very hard time for the remainder of the sort of Ukrainian population that's in the post-war Ukraine, because I don't think that they're going to get a significant type of Marshall Plan rebuilding and restructuring of their, shattered industrial economy. I just don't think that's happening. It's probably going to be that the higher human capital of the Ukrainian state is going to find its way to Western Europe and North America, and eventually they'll find agricultural labor to use from the third world in the rebuilt Ukrainian agricultural sector, if I had to guess.
Okay. And to conclude the discussion with two final questions going off on that, I think I've argued that one thing that we could see with this war conclusion is that Russia, there's some type of ceasefire agreement that maybe informally recognizes that the four territories that they claim as part of Russia now are part of Russia, or there's some line. Maybe Ukraine still claims that those oblasts are still Ukrainian, but they're effectively under Russian control. Would that still be a gay victory rather than a total Russian victory. Because I even think that like America doesn't even care that much. Kherson, gaining Kherson is maybe just another cherry on top for the war effort. But even if the Russians have it, as long as they still have Odessa, as long as they still have most of the country that is Ukraine, is that still anything less than a total victory for the gay? That's the first question. The second question is, what do you see as the conclusion of the war from this point?
So your first question, obviously, if the Ukrainians are just not going to agree to give Kherson City back unless like Russia goes over the Dnieper again and takes it, and even if they do take it, back through like military force or like some unforeseen negotiation process, the Ukrainian state is still going to have two major ports in Nikolaev and Odessa. Like the Ukrainians are going to keep holding Odessa. Unless the Russians get there, like that's just going to happen. And in that case, you're going to have like rail connections to the Ukrainian hinterland that are going to be using the port facilities that a lot of capital firms had been investing in the 2010s. That's like they've built up these ports to be both naval facilities and Ochkiv, which is like not too far off from Nikolaev. It was like a big naval base. And then, the actual like industrial port facilities would allow the gay to use the interior parts of Ukraine as basically grain leverage, right, over Turkey and Egypt and other countries in the Middle East. It'll be a significant asset for them if they're able to get any of the Ukrainian coastline with the port cities and rail line intact. That's just going to be an outright win. Plus, all of this territory, sure, like the Soviet Union was not like Russian per se, but these areas of southern Ukraine were built up during the Russian Empire and formed a significant part of the former Soviet Union's economy and defense structure. And if Russia doesn't get those back, Russia doesn't get those back. It's a huge victory in that sense because the remainder of the Russian state, no matter how the war ends, is going to end up strategically weaker than it would have been had there been even like a neutral Ukraine in between Europe or Russia, which is what the Russian Federation wanted from, the early 2000s. So in that sense, it is a total victory already for the gay in the sense that they've accomplished their geopolitical goals. And your second question, how does the war end up looking from here? And I think that we're going to see at least another year of this slow type of fighting. I think that after Bakhmut, we'll see a large amount of effort go into holding Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, like of keeping Ukrainian troops in northern Donbas until the last possible moment. And even if Russia advances into the Kharkov region or the Sumy region, Kharkov and Sumy both have pretty extensive defensive fortifications as well. So it's like that's going to be an additional fight. Like down in the south in Zaporozhye, the terrain is more open and there's not as many intensive fortifications there. So you might see a breakthrough if the Russians actually commit enough manpower and material for a offensive, but I don't necessarily see that happening. So in the end, we'll probably get like at least another year of this sort of slog of warfare. And barring any sort of complications with like Iran and Azerbaijan or, a different conflict in the Middle East or something like that, I think that this could go on for another few years, although I think that the Ukrainian sort of political and manpower situation will continue to get worse, not just in terms of the military situation, but also like significant amounts of people not only just leaving Ukraine, but leaving the eastern periphery where they know that they'll be repatriated to the Ukrainian military now. I think you'll see a lot more people going to, the UK or Germany, France, and the Northern American countries.
Right. Well, that is a very interesting conclusion to make. And I actually, the concluding thought I want to have on this segment is I don't think people should be like, oh, this is such a black pill. I think you really need to take the clear pill about the Ukrainian conflict. It was clearly not going to destroy the gay or really in our interests. And like what Russia is doing is something outside of what we're about. And it is important to the world. But I don't think you should be acting like the conflict is like a game between your favorite team and a rival, and that favorite team is getting beaten. I don't think you should approach that conflict. I think you should just see how this is impacting the world, what are the effects of it, and taking a much more neutral stance on it. So you should not be taking this as a black pill. You should take it as a clear pill. So on that note, that is it for this segment of Highly Respected. We're going to have to talk about some other topics with just me alone without our good friend Irk. But Irk, thanks for coming on today. It's been a pleasure to have you, and hopefully you really inform people and you raise their IQs today.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on, Irk. And now back to the regular episode of what we're going to discuss today. I think everyone enjoyed those discussions. So before we get into the cognitive elite questions, which we've got a few today, I want to discuss a topic that deals with Donald Trump. Donald Trump had an event over the weekend in South Carolina where he brought back some of his old fire and fury that we loved from 2016. He talked about illegal immigrants, how are bringing all these immigrants over to the country. He was echoing some of his sentiments from back in his 2016 campaign about how they're criminals, they're rapists, they're bringing drugs, they're bringing a lot of problems. And it was quite looking at some of his public performances, I thought that some of them have been a little lackluster, but I thought this one was pretty good that he did. But a lot of people were mad at Trump for various things over the weekend. One was the RNC chair race, which Ronna McDaniel won again against the new right or supposedly populist and challenger Harmeet Dillon. And the second is that he did this South Carolina event with Lindsey Graham, who endorsed him, and with what usually happens when somebody endorses you, you praise them. So I want to go over that before we get into the cognitive elite questions. On the RNC chair race, as once again I'm not saying that it was like great that Ronna McDaniel won. I think the main problem is that there wasn't a lot of candidates who wanted to get in the race to challenge Ronna McDaniel, because a lot of people who would have been serious candidates, not saying Harmeet was not a serious candidate, but she doesn't have quite the clout that a lot of these other players have, and she doesn't have a rapport with the donors that a lot of these other people have among the RNC delegates. The RNC delegates are their own little universe and they do their own thing. But there's, a lot of people talked about people like Lee Zeldin getting in the race, and people thought that Lee Zeldin would easily win. But people don't want to get in the race because they don't want to oversee a messy, brutal primary season. They do not want to really oversee this. People think this is a thankless task and they don't really get into it. And so a lot of people just like, well, whatever, she can have it. With Harmeet, a lot of people were blaming Trump for the loss, but sources tell me, and people know Harmeet, that she went up when she met with Trump. She specifically asked for that the former president not endorse her because she felt an endorsement would hurt her among the RNC delegates. Many of the RNC delegates are either never Trump or they want Trump to go away, and she felt that if she got endorsed by Trump, that would be problematic for her race. And in the race, even though people were considering her the MAGA candidate or the populist candidate, she was courting. Hold on a second, I had to fix my microphone there, but she was courting the never Trump vote in the RNC race, which is just a standard political procedure. And then so people saw this race. Ronna McDaniel won. she had double the amount of votes that Harmeet Dillon had, and all these people were very mad about this and like saying that the RNC's done. We're done with the Republican Party. I guess we're having a national divorce with the Republicans. But this was like an issue that, even much more so than the House Speaker race, was just not on the radar for people. In some ways, maybe you could say it should have been. Maybe it should have been more important. But in terms of long-lasting effects, people probably are going to forget this by the end of this week, probably even by today. I think it's that people will just move on. I pointed this out on Twitter, is that the number one news story from last week among the right-wing sphere was not the RNC race. It was Damar Hamlin being supposedly replaced by a body double. That was the stuff that was really exciting attention. People were tweeting it out and getting like 30,000 likes. I talked about this on the IQ supplement. That's what people were getting really worked up about. And that wasn't just like Twitter sphere. That stuff was getting big on TikTok, on Facebook, a lot of the normie platforms. If you really want to think about the RNC race, I think Fox News gave it some brief coverage, and the political outlets covered it, Politico, The Hill. But outside of that, it's not going to have a long-lasting impression on people. And then people are mad that Trump seemingly didn't take a side or was seemingly endorsing Ronna McDaniel, and that he congratulated Ronna McDaniel afterwards. I don't know. He's running as like a Republican presidential candidate. He doesn't have as much support as he did in 2020. He is trying to shore up support. And I think a lot of these people demand that Trump just tell everyone to fuck off and I'm not campaigning with you. And him to court the pro-DeSantis demographic that doesn't really care about Trump and is not going to support Trump no matter what he does for them. Because he's like done like courting of these people. I mean, a lot of these people offered tepid praise of Trump when he, endorsed J.D. Vance in the Ohio Senate primary. And he sent like letters to them thanking, they said, for your nice words. And then all these people, like a week later, went straight back to tweeting about Trump like a jilted ex-lover. And that's what they did. And there's even been people who were invited to his announcement speech who spend all their time tweeting about Trump like a jilted ex-lover. And they're all like expect that Trump should court these people. But these people have shown time and time again that first off, they really don't count on much of a support base, because if you look at what right-wing Twitter, mainstream right-wing Twitter tweets about and claims that they're, have a wave behind them, it's been shown to be false in most of these cases throughout 2022. They thought that the base was going to punish Trump for not endorsing Robbie Starbuck in a Tennessee congressional race, and that the base was all behind Robbie Starbuck. And Robbie Starbuck didn't even get on the ballot, due to the rules that they put in place, and they ran as a write-in candidate. And I think he only got like 3 or 4% of the vote in that race. They all predicted that Dr. Oz, when Trump endorsed Dr. Oz, that this was the end, that the base was going to revolt, and Kathy Barnett was going to be the real winner. Kathy Barnett came in third. Dr. Oz won despite the overwhelming opposition of mainstream conservative Twitter. There were several candidates that they were hyped up about throughout the campaign that ended up losing there. And then going even into this House Speaker's race, you would have thought that Ronna McDaniel was going to get destroyed, blown out, that everyone was behind Harmeet Dillon. And then in fact, it turned out to not be the case. And I think there is a limited, conservative media has a influence, I think, particularly with Fox News and some of the bigger outlets. But I think when it comes to Twitter, is that people overstate how important or influential it is and how much power and sway they have. And we, as I said, we keep getting this time and time again where these people are predicting that this person's done, they're finished, they're over, the base is revolting against them, and then the base, votes a completely different way, and then they go back to more copium and believing that that there was some reason that the base didn't vote the right way. And I think you saw this with the RNC race, is that it doesn't, what conservative Twitter is focused on doesn't quite matter. It's like even in the 2016 primary, all of conservative Twitter was extremely anti-Trump, and he still won the primary. And I think you're going to even see that sometime again with 2024 primary, even though there's a lot of other factors coming into the race. Besides that, with the 2024 race, it's like there's possibility of indictment or things that could change it up. But once again, the base, the actual real life people still support Trump. He's still the front runner. He still has nearly 50% support in the polls, despite the overwhelming hostility of conservative media and conservative Twitter. And this could once again prove that like what these guys are tweeting about is not reflected in the real world, and they're only reflecting their own little sphere. And I think that's why people automatically don't really care that much about the RNC race. It would be nice if somebody besides Ronna McDaniel was the RNC chair. But once again, like Trump was told to stay out of the race. Some of his supporters backed Ronna McDaniel. But, Harmeet Dillon specifically asked Trump to not endorse her. And he did that. And apparently apparently that was a problem that he didn't endorse her. And even if he had endorsed her, all these people would still be tweeting about him, a jilted ex-lover, and then they would be claiming that the reason why Harmeet lost was because of Trump's endorsement. And even when DeSantis supposedly endorsed Harmeet, it was like in the most vague, basic manner that was like hedging his bets that was done with that. But when it comes to Lindsey Graham, like Lindsey Graham, obviously terrible senator, but it's once again like Trump is in a weaker position this time, and any type of institutional support or figure support he can get, he's going to accept. And I don't think Lindsey Graham is going to be running his campaign like he did, or have as much influence over his campaign like he may have had in 2020. Trump is going to run, I think what the rhetoric he's started to use on Truth Social, what he's been using in his public appearances, he is trying to go back to that 2016 energy. Now, whether he can fully capture it, that's still a question. But I think we are seeing him realize that he's got to go on these angles that others aren't going to talk about. I don't think many of the other Republicans are going to go on the immigration angle. They want to go on something else. For DeSantis, it's COVID stuff and vax. Pence, it's abortion. Pompeo, it's foreign policy in Iran and Russia. So they are all having their own unique pitch, and Trump can really differentiate himself by going with an immigration pitch this time, going back to what it was in 2016, maybe even going on and off about reparations and race-related stuff. And I think that could really set him apart from the pack. I'm trying to be, hopeful. I think Trump still has a few issues to work out. He really needs to, I think, a few more rallies to show that he's got his magic back, he's got his mojo back, would be helpful to the cause. Him getting back on Twitter, I think he needs to do. But I'm feeling a little bit more white-pilled about Trump's campaign right now than I did probably in December when I did a podcast asking if Trump is actually running for president. I think I am a little bit more optimistic about his campaign now. And I think, these endorsements, there's going to be probably some shitty people are going to endorse him. There's probably going to be him doing events with some shitty people, but so is every other fucking candidate. Ron DeSantis is endorsed by Paul Ryan and Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush is actually a close advisor to him. Nobody complains about that on their side. So you could play this game with several other people, and as long as Lindsey Graham is not directing the campaign or the campaign's message, it's nothing I don't think to worry about. So those are the things I need to say on that matter on Trump. Still a little bit more optimistic about him. I think people are just wanting to throw a temper tantrum about any little thing that Trump does. Even if he meets with right-wing people, Kanye and Nick Fuentes, they complain about that. If he has a meeting with Lindsey Graham, they complain about that. Even if when he has a meeting with them, the people that are complaining, they have a problem with that. So there's nothing he can do that will please the peanut gallery on Twitter. He just has to keep going with and having a strong message and reach out to the American people and ignore what former sycophants and others are saying about him on Twitter, and just go forward with his message and ignore the shills that were eager to say everything that Trump did was amazing when he was president, and now they think that they can make more money through DeSantis' presidency, or they'll build status through that rather than with Trump. And so those are my thoughts on that. I need to get to the cognitive leak questions now. So I wonder if that'll be my controversial take from today. I think maybe people are in the comments are probably going to be mad about Ukraine because everyone likes to get mad on Twitter whenever I point out things going wrong with Russia in the war. People just insist that Russia is clearly, on their way to conquering Berlin any moment now. Not just Kiev, but all of Europe. So go with that. So I wonder what will be the most controversial take in the comment section, but we'll see. But we now have our Cognitive Elite questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Cognitive Elite option at Highly Respected Substack, and that's at highly-respected.substack.com. And make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there, and also read all the great articles I'm posting. I post at least one per week. Hopefully we, maybe make it too soon, but we'll see about that. So the first question is up. This one comes from Edward. He asks, Scott, what do you think about this so-called anti-CRT thing Ron DeSantis and Christopher Rufo are engaging in down in the new College of Florida? Good or bad development? I think it's a pretty good development. I mean, it's not as groundbreaking as or big of a deal as some people make it out, but it's like an interesting experiment they can do. What the new College of Florida is the shittiest public university in Florida. It's got a really bad enrollment. They're thinking about shutting it down. I think DeSantis has just said, hey, Christopher Rufo and these Hillsdale guys, hey, look, here's a university. You can do what you want with it. If it doesn't work out, we'll just shut down the university or move on. But maybe you can help it boost its numbers. So they're able to, it's a smaller university. I think it has only 800 enrollment of 800 students. It's in a lot of trouble. They're able to shake up things. It'll be interesting to see what happens, but I don't think it's going to be something that can be transferred to the other major universities in Florida just yet because of its size, and the purpose of it is just that this is a struggling university that they've thought about shutting down, and they're like, well, we'll just let Chris Rufo hold it up and see what happens. I don't think it's going to be as earth-shattering what they do. It really would just be creating, a Florida public university, or a Hillsdale that's a public Florida public university, then creating the new red pill university that some people may have, and it'll be probably equivalent to what the Hillsdale curriculum and all that, which is like fine. It's like conservative stuff, but it's not quite what we're about, dissident right stuff. And I saw somebody make a point, a good point on Twitter where it's saying that, it's an interesting idea, but I know a ton of people, this is the tweeter I'm quoting, I know a ton of people who've had a great books education, type of stuff that Hillsdale and all these other conservative universities like Grove City stress. And, they're into some interesting ideas. They're open to critiques of modernity, but they're extremely anti-racist. And they'll say that Aristotle was an anti-racist, and they're just filled with a lot of goofiness. So you'll see that maybe there'll be some examples of good things that could happen there. Maybe they could create some good curriculum. But if it just really becomes like the Hillsdale of Florida, I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world. It could even be a positive, but it's not one of the major Florida universities. People in Florida still want to go to FSU, Florida, Central Florida. Those are the main universities they're still wanting to go to. This will just be the Hillsdale option in Florida, and maybe people will want that. So we'll see what happens. I do feel that it may not work, and they'll just shut down the university anyway. It's like, well, they at least tried. I think that they'll see what they can do. I think one thing is, DeSantis is doing some good things on education. I give a lot of criticism of DeSantis. I think him barring AP African American history is probably one of the best things he's done. I think it's something that Trump did not do. Well, I think they just recently introduced AP African American history after Trump left. I'd have to double check, or started mandating it nationwide. So I'd have to look into when they looked at it. But a lot of the other things, it's stuff that Trump did as president. Stop Woke Act. Trump also is barring critical race theory in federal government training. DeSantis now brought it to state government training and even some of the schools. Even some of the immigration stuff. I think actually Trump did a lot more at the federal government level than DeSantis is doing at the state level, and all those various things. But that is one good thing that he's done. I think he does have an interest in education and setting different policy. But even when it comes to something like the University of Florida, his grand solution was put Ben Sasse as president, which maybe isn't the huge W that people would think. But going back to the new College of Florida question, it'll be interesting to see. I don't say it's a bad development, but I think it may be an overstated development by, this is a small university that they're under threat of being shut down. And DeSantis like, here, run an experiment with it. Maybe it might work, maybe it won't. But I think it's an interesting development. It's a good development, but it's not as big of a deal as some people make it out to be. And the second question, moving on to the second question. This one comes from Jack. He asks, hi, Scott. In your article this week about Americans and immigration, you commented that Republicans should make immigration personal and avoid bland messaging about border security. Do you think trying to tie mass immigration to the environment and pollution could be a successful strategy? I know you have poked fun at environmentalism but base before, but I've seen this idea shared by VDare and other solid conservative pundits who are definitely with our issues. This certainly won't win over DSA type people, but maybe there are some people this could win over. I think it's still an interesting argument. I don't really disprove it or say that you shouldn't use it. I probably would say it's not as effective as it could be because people who are really motivated by environmental reasons to do stuff are just so libtarded and left-wing now that if you even with a lot of normal conservatives, like environmentalism is just like seen as like recycling. You could put it in this way that's saying that with more immigration, our national parks would have more litter and all these stuff, and people won't pick up after themselves. There is like an environmental argument that things will be less clean, that people will not clean up after themselves. You'll see more trash everywhere and that stuff, which that is partially environmental, but that is also a quality of life issue that you can place into that. The environmental issue is, I think it's not as effective as maybe it was in the 70s and 80s, because the original immigration restriction, well, not the original immigration restrictionist movement, but the post-65 immigration restrictionist movement was initially founded by all these environmentalist types who learned this argument and felt that mass immigration was going to create more environmental problems for America. But that was a completely different generation. Every environmentalist group is now pro-open borders, Sierra Club, all those types. They always talk about how we need amnesty because these are undocumented environmentalists. This is the exact argument they do. And so even the people who would respond to any arguments about environmentalism are probably more resistant towards any type of argument that may be immigration restrictionist, because every environmentalist now goes down the list of left-wing talking points and left-wing agenda items much more so than they did in years past, in the 30 or 20 years ago. I don't think it's a bad argument to make, though, if someone's going to write a column about it or pitch it to some people, because it is a true argument. I think it can persuade a few people. I just don't think it persuades people at the mass level that we need. I think it's you can make a quality of life issue about it, as I said, with like dirty streets and all these other things, and everyone littering everywhere. You can make that argument. I think it's still, you really have to still tie it to quality of life rather than the kind of abstract environmental issue of just like you showing data and graphs and saying like, well, this will lead to more pollution and all these types of things. Because right-wing people probably care less about environmentalism than any time before, even though there's more conservative pundits making environmentalist arguments than prior times. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I would, even though Jack says that I've said it cringe, I've probably more said it's not as powerful of an argument as some people think is like environmentalism but based, or environmentalism from the right. I just don't think there are that many people who are ready for it. And I would say that there are wanting it. And I think that's the same with, it comes with the immigration issue of environmentalism but based, or using the environmentalist arguments. I don't think it's going to convince as many people as other arguments as making it personal, but I think it's fine argument to make. Maybe I could be wrong on it, but I think conservatives are probably not going to make that argument, because most of the environmentalist agenda now is about creating green jobs for minorities rather than solving the environment. As I point out with the Green New Deal, the Green New Deal is all about redistributing white wealth to non-whites. It's not about making the environment nicer. And all these environmentalists are the same. And even if you look at all these idiotic climate protests, their main goal is to destroy a great Western works of art than to solve the environment. And these types of people are never going to support immigration restriction. There is maybe a few centrists and independents who maybe, they watch something on global warming or documentary, or there's some report on it, and then if you tell them like, hey, if you really think this is important, well, this is what a billion Americans will do for the environment. This is what mass immigration will do to the environment, and you can make those arguments for it. So I don't think I would not say it's completely ineffective or completely wrong to make this argument. I just don't think it's as able to persuade people as much as people think. And I think you really just, even if it is an environmentalist argument, you still have to tie it to quality of life issues. Now the third and final question comes from Jay, and Jay actually has a sports question. He's asking, you were talking about sports ball again this week. Remember this? And it's Eagles fans cheering on Michael Irvin, who was a famous wide receiver, one of the best wide receivers in the 90s, who played for Cowboys. He got a career-ending injury in playing against the Eagles, and all the Eagles fans cheered when he had the injury. And, he's talking about what, the tribalism of football, and he's like, Philadelphia fans took a lot of shit because they were cheering after it happened. Here's my question. In the 90s where I grew up, most fans that followed the NFL were Eagles fans, but there was a significant number of people that were Cowboys fans. When I asked them about it, their reason was something like they hated Eagles fans. Do you see this phenomenon anywhere else? Looking back, I guess they were reactionaries. I guess he's talking about the tribalistic mindset, where people just simply not like something because their enemies hate this. And you see this a lot of places. You see this a lot in politics, is that the other side supports something, so we hate it. I think you can see this with even something on like immigration, what we just talked about, is that a big reason that Democrats probably are more in favor of open borders because they associate immigration restriction with their political enemies. Thus, they take the opposing side. And I think also that liberals are so eager to champion drag queen story hour just because it triggers their political enemies. So this happens a lot in politics. But even with sports, you really see the type of tribalism of human nature come out. And I think that's why a lot of people like sports, is that people really get angry and upset about that. You probably see more people fight over what's their favorite NFL team than you would have over anything political in nature. I mean, you can go to some sports bars after on Saturday night and just see guys fight over something as idiotic as that. And you obviously see this phenomenon anywhere else. I think it is a fundamental nature of tribalism, is that I don't like these people. What do they like? Well, I hate that too. And that's just a fundamental part of human nature. And I do want to this isn't necessarily part of the topic, but I do want to go off a little bit about the tribalistic nature of NFL sports and how fervently interested in this topic people are. I made the tweet saying that more people are outraged by the NFL refs allegedly rigging the Bengals-Chiefs game than they are by 250,000 illegals crossing the border last month, which is 100% true. Nobody really tweeted about that. There was no trending topic about that, but the trending topic was NFL rigged. ESPN's talking all about it. All these, even a lot of political commentators are talking about this. Like tons of people are doing threads about this. You even saw a lot of anger over the Cowboys game the prior weekend, and people were almost calling for January 6th against the Cowboys headquarters. Like, we have to replace Jerry Jones. Like, I saw these people, who are really into politics, do like these 12 tweet long threads about how the Cowboys need a totally clean house and get rid of Jerry Jones, their owner. And I was like, I don't think you have any influence over this random Twitter guy. But people were just getting really worked up about it. And there's a negative impression we can make of this, where our conclusion then saying that, people are just obsessed with the bread and circuses and they would prefer these frivolous matters than serious ones. I think that is true. But there's a less negative aspect about this, is that people really, particularly men, really like tribalism. They really like being part of a tribe. They really having that sense of community. They like having an enemy that's like they're so bad, they're so evil because they're root for the Bengals or whoever their enemy team is. And like, we're great because we're Browns fans. And having that bit of rivalry and and sits a tribal community. There's few other avenues in American life that offer that to people. And I think that's why people are so interested in sports, because there's been a decline in civil associations in a lot of these community groups. Even like anything that gives people a sense of identity. While sports teams give you that sense of identity, they put you in a part of a community. They give you like something to root for and to cheer for and see yourself as part of a greater whole. And at the same time, it gives you enemies to define yourself against and to hate, and in a safe, convenient manner that's not going to cost you your job. Demanding all Eagles fans dies might not get you fired from your job, or just like talking about Eagles fans as the worst people on earth. That won't get you fired from your job, but talking about a certain other demographics will. So I think it does give people a safe way to channel their tribalistic instincts. And that's why people gravitate towards sports so much. And I think after a lot of what we saw with COVID, like the lockdowns, the riots, everything from 2020, I think that's why more people are going harder towards sports fandom in response to the radical changes in American life. And even though sports no longer offer quite the escape they once were, because now there's pride nights and, in racism in the end zone and all the players talking about how they support BLM, it still represents more of an escape than other entertainment options in America, or even politics. And people gravitate towards it so they can unleash these primal energies and these desires, these longings that many American men in particular have. And it gives them something that they can, focus on without having to risk their job, their livelihood, or their reputation. So those are my concluding thoughts for today on this IQ supplement. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the Irk segment. A lot of people have been demanding, or not demanding, but requesting that we have more guest appearances. So we'll try to work on that more in 2023 and see what topics we can get our old favorites back on to discuss and ponder on. So we're going to have an incredible IQ supplement later this week. I've been talking about for over a week about how I'm going to do something on the awful dilemma and their voting patterns, and I've kept putting it off. That may be the IQ supplement this week, or it may be an article. So it'll be a surprise what the IQ supplement is. So be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.